Great, so we're underway. So thanks everybody for joining. Great to have you back again for another session. I'm going to finish off the prepared material that I've been going through rather too slowly over the last few sessions. As I mentioned last time, this session is going to focus a bit more on writing papers themselves and some of the issues around co-authors, responding to reviewers, submitting to journals, that kind of stuff. So this session is especially suited for those who are grappling with the whole world of actually writing papers and trying to persuade other people that they're worth publishing. So thanks for joining us. So here's email address, Facebook group, lab website, and so on. Please reach out and get in contact. It's great to see the activity that's begun at UQ with a journal club getting underway, which is brilliant, and people sharing their sorrows and triumphs in that type of environment, which is really nice. And I understand it's been a really encouraging group where people can really gain encouragement from each other. And I think that's really important. Writing can be a very lonely exercise sometimes. You kind of lock yourself away at your desk, spend hours or days or weeks wrestling with this piece of writing in private, and sometimes sharing that and talking about that with other people can be a really useful experience. So that's definitely one thing that we should consider. I think trying to share it, and in your either in your lab environment with people that you work with, or as a journal club type environment where there may be people that you don't necessarily know so well, and that can be almost beneficial, I think, when talking about some of the challenges of writing. So, you know, the old adage, a problem shared is a problem halved. Okay, so I just posted the link to the Google spreadsheet once again. This is just to reiterate that the opportunity is very much there, and very keen for people to add their questions into that Google spreadsheet. Once I've finished going through my prepared material, we'll be going through all of the material in the Google spreadsheet to make sure that all the questions have been answered. So it isn't wasted. If you write a question into that document, we will eventually come to it in the rest of these sessions. So please do add further questions you have, or answer questions that other people have raised. There's already some really nice answers and tips on there already. Okay. All right, I finished last session by talking about the first draft and strategies for managing drafts. And as I was looking at, you know, where to start this session again after the break that we've had, I really wanted to reiterate some of the things that I said about the first draft. Emma's asked if we could post the Google Doc in the chat. It's right there. You may have joined after the chat started. I really wanted to reiterate about the perfect first draft, because I think this is such an important point. It really bears repeating. And it's something I think that causes a lot of us to struggle more than we should with writing. Some struggle is, of course, inevitable. And writing a good paper is solving a very complex puzzle that takes time, and it takes energy, emotional energy, and it takes skill. But this is a common mistake we can all avoid. What is the perfect first draft? Well, I can tell you what the perfect first draft isn't. It isn't a fully polished, almost complete version of the manuscript. It's something well before that, and I think this is really important. The perfect first draft is incomplete. The clue is in the title. It's a draft. It's the first one that you produce. It's something like a stem cell that could develop in a number of different ways. A perfect first draft is not complete, is not polished, doesn't have everything done, may not be your best ever piece of writing, but it's a start. And once you've started, you've hammered out something. Maybe you've talked about the purpose of your paper. Maybe you've covered and talked about some of your key results. Maybe you've got some figures in there. Those figures may not be well polished or particularly well presented, but you've got some key basic material together. You're excited about the results. You know what they are. You know why they're important, maybe a few discussion points. There may not be any citations, and it may not be carefully drafted, thoroughly written text. I think this is important. The first draft is not necessarily a great and polished piece of writing. It's often something you write pretty soon after you know what the results are. Often this is at the time, if you're anything like me, when you're most excited about the work you're doing. You know what the results are. You've discovered something new, if things have gone well, and you're excited and happy about it. And that's a good time to be writing about your work. I think it gets harder and harder the more time and distance passes between that excitement of discovery and trying to write about it. And a caveat that I did mention last time, this is going to vary a little bit from lab to lab and from co-author group to co-author group. And you obviously have to bear that in mind. If your supervisor has said, don't send me anything unless it's almost complete, then, well, there's not much you can do other than comply with that. But what I would suggest you do is send it to some other people perhaps before it's complete, maybe some colleagues and fellow PhD students or postdocs, and make a reciprocal deal with them to try to get people to look at your work earlier. The earlier that someone can look at your draft, the more useful their comments will be, because you can then change direction without having already invested too much effort in creating the work. So I really would encourage you to share your writing with others at an early stage, and you'll have a joint understanding that the work is at an early stage, and that's the whole point. That's what a draft is. Don't be embarrassed and don't be shy about sharing your work with others when it's in an early state and in the early stages. I think that's really important. And in our research group, we very much encourage people to share their drafts early, so that we can go through things together in that very early stage and potentially prevent a lot of wasted time and wasted work. That's not to say that U-turns and deciding against a certain course of action can happen quite late in papers too, and that can be frustrating when it happens. But the earlier you start to share that work, the more you reduce that possibility in the future. Fire any questions about that into the chat. I think this is a really important aspect of writing and something we often struggle with. I think a lot of us have a sense of perfectionism. We maybe are looking at the writing on the papers of our supervisors, and we're seeing these brilliant, polished, lovely papers coming out. And if we think we're going to produce one of them, we have to get it perfect before we even send it to our supervisor for them to look at. I think you need to try to struggle against that psychologically, and can be a real psychological barrier, I think. And a very nice comment there on the chat about a writing exchange in the journal club, showing each other your writing and sharing those results. I think that's wonderful. And for those people at UQ, have a look at the chat and make contact if you want to be part of that group. And being part of a group that's outside your normal research lab group could be a very useful addition to your writing toolbox. It won't suit everyone, but it will suit some people very, very strongly, and really encourage you to do that. Okay. That's the perfect first draft. I included a very practical tip right at the end of the last session about simple ways of keeping track of different versions that you're working on. It sounds very minor, sounds a bit unimportant, but think about how you title and number the different versions of your manuscript as you go through it. And I think this can really help you in two ways. First of all, it helps you stay organised. and it helps your co-authors stay very organised. You know, they can instantly tell when they look at one of their emails in their inbox that's got 3,000 emails in it. They can instantly tell which version of the manuscript you're talking about, and you can tell who's commented on which version and so on. So it helps you keep organised and sort of tidy as you're building up a manuscript. I think the second thing that this kind of system really helps you do is to, and this is especially important earlier in your career, it helps you to I think, learn from how one version has changed over time into other versions and got better and better. You know, you could, in theory, forensically go back and track your introduction, for example, in your paper, and actually have a look at some of the earlier versions and how the later versions improved on it. What sorts of things changed? What kinds of sort of false starts did you make earlier on in the earlier versions of the paper? And, you know, can you learn from that and gain experience from that as you come to draft future papers? So I think this kind of system can be very useful. It's also useful to look back at comments that somebody made on an earlier version. You might be able to remember a comment, but you can't place it. You could search back through this kind of system and find previous comments quite easily. So little tip there, it needn't be in this exact format, but in something that sorts nicely when you look at it in Windows Explorer. Okay. So I suppose moving on from that, co-authors, we very rarely write, I mean, almost never these days, you hardly ever see it these days, single author papers. Very rarely do we sit down on our own and write a paper on our own and do all the science and do everything from start to finish all on our own. It does sometimes happen, not often. Usually we're working with co-authors when we write our work. There's an interesting nexus here, I think, when you're doing research, when you're doing a higher research degree, particularly if you're doing something like a master's, or perhaps even earlier when you're doing honours and you're writing a thesis, and you're basically doing research, and you may have the aim of writing up that thesis as a paper and submitting it. There's quite an interesting nexus there between having to do the work yourself, in the sense that you're being graded and examined on the basis that you're writing your own honours thesis, and then subsequently working with co-authors to create a submission for a paper. And different lab groups deal with that issue in different ways. So definitely work out how that's dealt with in the environment in which you're working. But for most of us, especially for PhD students and beyond, you'll be working with co-authors often from the beginning, really. You'll be working with others in different parts of your research work. You know, we've all got different skills. Science is very advanced these days. There's lots of different aspects to science, and it's basically impossible to be really good at all aspects of what you might need when you come to write a particular paper or do a particular piece of work. And often we get together in teams. Science is typically team-based. So again, don't sit there on your own trying to write your paper from scratch, from start to finish. You're working as part of a team, and it's really worth trying to remember that as you move through different stages of writing. Now think about your co-author group. Maybe in your mind right now, you can think about a paper that you're working on now. Think about all the co-authors involved. They may not even be co-authors at this stage. They could be people that are working with you, or that you've hassled for help or advice as you're trying to build your particular research project. Think about those people. Think about the skills that they've got. Think about the different constraints that those people are under. Are some of them under extreme time pressure? Do they have 1 hour a week that they could devote to your paper? Do they have 1 hour a month or 2 hours a day? You know, think about the different time pressures that different co-authors may be under, and use that strategically when you ask them for advice and for input into your manuscript. Think about the different feedback that you get from them. Are they providing useful, thought-provoking feedback? Think about the feedback. Don't just sort of blindly accept feedback that anyone gives you. Think about its utility from each of the co-authors. Sometimes, in fact, commonly, you know, co-authors will have different views, and that's right and proper. We're all human beings. We all approach things slightly differently. Science is not, you know, there's a lot of art involved in science. You could create a paper in a number of different ways from the same underlying data set. And I think that's really important to remember. And there are many ways of approaching it. Therefore, there will be many opinions among co-authors. And as a general piece of advice, it's nice to work with people who you can get along with and will get along with each other as far as possible. But your job, somehow in the middle of all this, is to try to keep this train on the track. When co-authors may disagree with each other, you know, can you resolve those conflicts in a polite and constructive way? Conflict's going a bit far. It's quite rare for actual conflict to emerge in co-author groups, but it does happen sometimes. And it's good, it's really good to ensure that your co-authors feel listened to, that they feel part of a group where there's some group decision making happening. At the end of the day, co-authors, all of us as science, you know, most people are reasonable people, have realised they can't get their own way all the time. But you have to handle these situations, I guess, carefully. And coming into this, maybe as a PhD student, maybe as, you know, writing your first collaborative paper, it can be a bit of a shock, I think, that human side of all of this, dealing with all of your co-authors as individuals and as human beings. Add co-authors as you need them. I personally, again, there are many different approaches to this, and you must ensure that you understand what's expected in your lab group and in your particular environment. And if you don't know, it's worth asking about it. Ask your supervisor or boss or whoever it might be relatively early on in the piece. You know, what's your approach to co-authors? You know, ask them about it to avoid making promises you can't keep, or making mistakes in dealing with and adding and subtracting co-authors. My personal approach is to be as open and inclusive as possible. The way I look at it is that if anybody has some energy they want to devote to my paper that I'm leading, then, you know, I'm going to be the first author that you know, your paper is yours. If someone else has some energy they want to put into that, then so brilliant, bring it on. So my approach is to try to be as inclusive as possible with co-authorships. If you're unsure whether a contribution from a potential co-author is particularly large, I would always err on the side of caution and ask them if they would like to be a co-author. You know, say that you value their contribution and you would be delighted if they would join you as a co-author. I see no real downside to more co-authors, obviously beyond some reasonable grouping. Perhaps the main downside, once co-authorship groups get too big, and by that I'm probably talking about 10 and beyond kind of territory, things can get difficult to manage. You have so many people, so many different viewpoints coming in, it can be a bit difficult. What I've seen work quite successfully in those circumstances is often there's a smaller group of kind of core co-authors who are a smaller group of people who are much more closely involved in the project. Then there may be another group who are providing useful contributions, but not perhaps in the same kind of overarching and way. Maybe they're helping with one very specific aspect. In that case, I've often seen it work well where co-author groups are sort of divided into a core group and then the entire group, and that the manuscript can be worked up with a core group and then shared more widely as it starts to take shape. That can help reduce just getting huge amounts of opinion, especially from someone who maybe knows one part of the manuscript well but doesn't know the whole thing extremely well. So I found that could be a useful technique. But overall, I think be inclusive and be generous. I don't really see the need for wrangling over who should and shouldn't be co-authors on a manuscript. There's no real downside to you as the lead author, and there's no real downside to whoever's the last author on the paper either. It's just a crowd of differing sizes in between. Okay. So be strategic. I've kind of alluded to this before. Use your co-authors strategically. Don't just send everything to everyone all the time. Subject to your discussions with your supervisor about what's expected, do send a jumbled first draft to your supervisor, providing your supervisor is the kind of person who is happy to see a rough first draft. I would argue they should be, but if they're not, then don't send it to them. So send your jumbled first draft. You're excited, your words have tumbled out, and you want to get that out quickly. Yeah, send it to your supervisor, but don't send it to that senior collaborator from Yale. You know, that one you're really trying to kind of woo and impress. Send them something a little bit further down the line that's a bit more developed, right? So be strategic about it. Don't just be sort of scattergun and send everything to everyone. Second part of that is that you may want particular input from particular people about particular aspects of the work. So you may want to send a version just to one or two co-authors and you know, maybe ask them for some particular feedback about one particular aspect of the work. So you can do that directly with them. But by and large, I think it's quite nice to be sending your manuscript out in waves to most people. That may be a core group or the entire co-author group, depending how big it is. But there might be one or two people that you want to withhold it from, not for secrecy, but simply because you want to be strategic and you want to respect their time rather than sending them every single version. Now, this is important, I think, communicating openly and very clearly with your co-authors. Co-authors are invested in your work, right? I mean, they care about it too. Like, yes, it's a co-authorship. It's probably less important to them than papers that they're leading or papers that they are anchoring or last authoring out of their research group. But co-authorships are important. And people are keen to know how your paper's going, and they want to know that the investment they've already made in their time is, you know, is eventually going to lead somewhere. So co-authors like to be, I think, kept abreast of what's happening. So don't be shy. Send out updates. If you're struggling with a particular piece of analysis, or you've realized, you know, the GIS problem is taking 6 weeks to sort out instead of a few days that you first hoped it might. Sorry, my internet's looking a bit unstable. Let me just... Okay, I've restarted. Sing out if my internet drops, please. So keep in touch with your co-author group. Tell them what their deadlines. So let them know if you've suffered any setbacks or there's going to be delays in the next steps in the manuscript. So feel free to do that. You can also prepare people for when to expect drafts to hit their inboxes again. Something I do, or I try to do. I'm not perfect in this, but what I try to do in my group is to negotiate with people when they might send the next version of a manuscript. And then I actually block out time in my diary on that day. And then as long as they send the manuscript by the night before, then I get to look at it, straight away, more or less, after they've sent it to me. So if you can, and obviously this works for people who are intimately and closely associated with your paper, you may want to say to them, have you got some time, a window in the next 3 or 4 weeks that we could set aside for you to look at my manuscript, and I'll send it to you the day before so that you get the latest version and you can then spend that allotted time on the manuscript. Obviously this works if you keep your promise. There has to be something there. It could completely backfire if you've made somebody set aside some time and then the manuscript does not appear. But it's one thing you can do to try to get around this perennial problem of you've sent your manuscript to your supervisor, you don't hear back from them for a month, right? That's a common occurrence. I've been the cause of those sorts of delays in the past. They are difficult. Your supervisor's likely to be, or your principal co-authors are likely to be very busy people, and it may just come at a bad time and they just can't get to it for several weeks. And that can slow you down, that can hamper your progress and your momentum when you're writing a paper. But instead of blaming it on your supervisor or co-author, I think try to work out a strategy where you can work to solve the problem. You can be proactive and try and find a way to solve the problem. And negotiating a time slot, I think, is one way of doing that. Again, some supervisors might say, no, I'm not going to do that, but it's worth a shot. It might work. Allied to that, communicate your deadlines with your co-authors. Make clear when you want feedback by. This may sound pushy, but it's not pushy at all. Again, it's respectful of your co-author's time. It is pushy if you say, I want this back tomorrow. That won't work. That's not realistic. But if 2 to 3 weeks is a reasonable period of time to expect feedback in. And if you can communicate that deadline clearly, and obviously politely, it would be wonderful if you could provide your feedback to me by the 22nd of August or whatever the deadline is. That can help your co-authors know when you're expecting it back. It gives them a degree of latitude. They can figure out when they've got time to look and ensure they get it back by the deadline. So make sure you are clear, and communicating frequently with co-authors helps them know that the thing's continuing to go and makes for a sort of happy group of people. It helps maintain a sense of teamwork. And again, I think group emails to your co-authors also reinforces that you're in this together, there's a sense of teamwork, and everyone has a stake in the progression of the paper. Remember that if you're the one leading and writing the paper, it's really down to you to try to manage things to make everything work, so that people work together, so that your co-authors enjoy the process and would be open to doing it again in the future, and that you're building networks, not burning bridges. And I think this is important. Your co-authors are human beings. You've got to work with them as human beings. Don't treat them as machines providing edits into your manuscript. Okay. I mentioned this point already, that core groups of co-authors might emerge as well as the whole group. It's fine to manage that quite explicitly. So you can send an email to the whole group that says, the paper's coming together. I'm going to progress the structuring the paper out and beginning and building the draft with a smaller group. Then I'll come back to the bigger group for input a bit later on. Making that clear is a good thing to do. You don't want people to feel left out. So you could always say, if you want to see versions between now and then, do let me know. Right. But giving people clear signposts and clear options to opt in and out is a useful strategy. Just communicate. Okay. So moving on, I think now to the, before I move on to that, does anybody have questions or things I'd like to raise now about co-authors and co-authorship groups and so on? Feel free to raise them in the chat, or if they go into the Google Doc, we'll get to those eventually as well. I know this is a topic that causes some consternation amongst us as we write papers. Okay, nothing appearing in the chat, so we'll move on. I want to talk now a bit about, perhaps this. At what point should somebody be removed? Good question. That's a very unhappy circumstance if this is being contemplated. I guess a co-author might be removed for a number of reasons. There's one reason that I would never do it for, and that's because you decided their contribution is too minor and that they should be removed now. I just wouldn't bother doing that. I think it can create bad feeling. I think it's just a bit unnecessary. If somebody's got to the point of being on there, I don't think you should necessarily unilaterally decide that they should be removed. There may be some circumstances that I'm overlooking where that could happen. There are other reasons why sometimes a co-author may wish to be removed, and that's an entirely different circumstance. This can happen for a number of reasons. A co-author might say, very genuinely say, look, I really feel I just haven't done very much, and I kind of it feels a bit wrong for me to be a co-author on this manuscript. I've seen that happen a number of times. I've even done it myself a few times, where I've actually said, yeah, I just haven't really been able to contribute very much, and I feel bad being a co-author. I think you should remove me from the co-author list. So if a co-author reaches out and says that, then absolutely you should comply with what they've asked for. If you it can be a tricky situation to manage, right? Because there are other circumstances where co-authors don't like something in the paper and wish to be removed for those reasons. And if that happens, they may want to, how should I put it? They may wish to say it's because they feel they haven't done very much, right? I get the feeling that has happened once or twice in the scientific community, where well-meaning people have said, actually, I haven't contributed very much, please take me off. Whereas what they really mean is, there's something I just don't agree with in this paper, and I just don't want to be a co-author on it, so please take me off. But they didn't want to say that because they don't want to hurt your feelings. So I think it can be a tricky situation if somebody says, I don't feel I've done enough, please remove me from the manuscript. Should you then write to them and say, oh, please, I think you have done a lot, so I'd love you to be a co-author, and try to persuade them to stay? My advice is don't do that unless you know for sure that they're genuinely being polite and actually being honest about that. I hope I've made that clear. It's a tricky situation. Sometimes co-authors don't want to be on a paper. They may disagree with part of it. They may feel some of it is just not what they would write and doesn't reflect what they want to say. And that's fine. But they may not want to hurt your feelings. So if somebody asks to be removed, for the most part, you should remove them unless they're a close colleague and you think actually they have done a lot. I think I want to try and persuade them to stay. I don't know, Kay, who raised that question, if there's any other circumstances that you're considering, but my general advice is it should be very rare for co-authors to be removed, and don't unilaterally remove them. Generally only remove them if they've asked to be removed. That, of course, there can be more extreme circumstances where some sort of war breaks out. It's really, really rare, but I guess it can happen. And to be honest, under those sorts of circumstances, if things are getting really quite difficult, and I've only seen this, very difficult situations, maybe 2 or 3 times probably out of 150 papers, you know, so it's rare. If there's a genuine conflict situation, you really at that point should be leaning on the senior co-authors and your supervisor and the senior authors of a manuscript to help resolve those conflict situations. And that's especially true if you're getting emails directly from an individual co-author, you know, directly at you, and you're not comfortable. Share that with your supervisor or other trusted senior co-author and have them help or direct resolving that situation. As a lead author, especially earlier on in your career, you can feel like you're in the middle of a kind of messy situation, and if you feel that's beginning to happen, don't try to deal with it on your own. Bring in trusted colleagues. You could even bring in people from outside the co-author group, other senior trusted colleagues in your department or school who might be able to help resolve those or give you advice in how to handle that situation. It's really rare. Okay, I'm going super slow. I'm slowing down the further I go through this. Okay, I want to move on to be thinking about the publication process a little bit more. We've covered lots to do with writing itself and lots to do with managing groups and writing in teams. I want to talk a bit about submitting papers to journals. And I'll get started with this today and continue it in the session on Wednesday, the next session, session 5. Now, broadly speaking, deciding which journal to submit to really depends, of course, on what you've discovered and what your angle is going to be in how you couch that discovery. And this sounds really obvious, and it is obvious. If you haven't discovered something pretty amazing, you can't submit it to a pretty amazing journal, right? So what I'm saying is, you can't just create great papers out of thin air. You have to have done good science in the first place. You have to have done good research and discovered something important and worthwhile in the first place. And then on top of that, you've got to figure out, what your angle is. I mentioned earlier that from the same set of results, probably 20 different papers could be written from that same set of results that would angle the whole thing in different ways. And the sort of converse of that is that from the same set of results, you could write a paper that could end up in Nature, or you could write a paper that has no chance of ending up in Nature, depending on what the angle that you've chosen and the way in which you've chosen to couch those results and to couch the study. Now, this sounds dishonest, but it's not dishonest at all. What you're trying to do when you angle your paper, you're trying to pitch your result You're not dressing up your result beyond what it is, but you're trying to pitch it into a space where people can appreciate its significance and importance. And this is really important, that you choose that right angle and that you think about the fundamental problem or issue area that your paper or your results are addressing, and where it sits in the sort of pantheon of knowledge that's out there already. Why is this exciting? You've got to work all of this out and really decide how you're going to choose to pitch the piece of work that you've done. And again, to repeat, it's not dishonestly dressing up what you've done to be better than it is. It's getting the best value out of the work you've done by showcasing it in the most effective way. So I think getting that thinking in place, getting that angle in place is really important. And sometimes papers need to be re-angled halfway through. Now, this can be an incredibly frustrating thing to happen halfway through drafting a paper, but you know, the extra work involved can be worthwhile. Sometimes you get halfway through and you think, wow, I realized that if we pitch the paper in this way, we could target an even higher impact journal with this work, because I've now begun to realize it has implications in all these other implications that I've only just really worked through in my own mind. Now I've realized we could repitch and re-angle this paper. Now, this is all tied up, of course, with choosing which journal you're going to submit your paper to. And really, I think that choice is embodied in the basic facts of the discovery itself. Have you discovered something that is, have you made a rare discovery, basically, an important and rare discovery that is, a 1 in 20 type discovery where you think, right, this one has a great chance in the highest impact journals. And I don't just want to focus this on publishing in Nature and Science, because that's not really what this is about. Most of our publishing, with very few exceptions, most of us, including me, almost all of our publications are not in Nature and Science or the highest impact journals, right? Let's be open and clear about that. And your publishing, your choices of journals really should reflect a broad portfolio of science that you're doing, right? Every now and then, your papers will be punctuated. You would expect, if you're doing good research, every now and then you make one of those rare discoveries that, yes, that's worth trying for a really high impact journal. In most other circumstances, you're trying to aim for definitely the best journal you can, but the most appropriate journal that has the right kind of, body of papers that fit the discovery and the type of paper that you want to write. You need to show, as you build your CV, that you can make solid disciplinary contributions, as well as occasional flashy higher impact papers in the magazines and the higher impact journals, right? And I think as you're crafting your CV, perhaps you're applying for a job and you're talking about your publication record, I think it's good to be able to point that out and say that you publish in strong disciplinary journals, as well as occasional publications in multidisciplinary high impact journals. So don't approach every paper as going, oh, can I get this into Nature? I just don't think that's the right way of thinking about it. Most of your work will end up in disciplinary journals, and that's great. And that's as it should be. Some of your work will end up in very low impact regional journals. And that's true for my papers I'm involved with and many other research groups. Important work that needs to be done isn't always the sort of work that's going to get published in highest impact journals. Okay, so we talked a bit about that, and we're going to come back to some of these issues in more detail a bit later on in the next session. A lot of us struggle with how good does my paper have to be before my paper gets submitted. And I'm going to spend a bit of time and show you a graph to help you remember how good your paper should be later on. We'll also cover a little bit about how to write a compelling cover letter that will cause an editor to choke on their cornflakes and immediately demand that your paper is sent out for review. Okay. So a few more notes on your angle, working out the angle for your paper. Ultimately, make your paper as big a deal as you can. Now, in some cases, you know, I've already mentioned this is not about dishonestly dressing it up, but you may need to think about this before you get to, well, you should think about this before you get to the writing stage. As you're constructing your research work, that goes hand in hand with thinking about that endpoint, how am I going to write this up and sell this work when it's finished? Of course, you won't necessarily know what the results are going to be or which way it's going to go, but you know, you'll have an inkling of what the best possible outcome would be from your study, and you can have a plan for thinking about how you might end up getting that work into a high impact journal. Ask yourself some questions. Can you scale up the work you're doing? If you're working on a regional study, could you make it a continental study or a global study? Is there any reason why an analysis that you've done at a national scale can't be made international? Or a study that you've done with 25 species can't be done with 200? You know, think about scaling up in whatever way makes sense for the type of science that you're doing. Can you make the scale bigger? Don't just be limited because you think, oh, my computer can't run it, you know, quick enough. Well, get a bigger computer, use the supercomputer. There's lots of ways around finding bigger computing resources. Don't let technicalities get in the way and stifle your best ideas. If you have great ideas and you want to try and scale them up, try to make that happen. That's one way of trying to emphasize and demonstrate the generality and the importance of what you've done. Are there themes that you could speak to that are global themes that would resonate with lots of other people that are reading and potentially reading your work? Those examples there come from, I suppose, the narrow world in which I operate, but these are examples of some of the sort of bigger picture themes that I have tried to pitch papers in. So don't start off with line 1 of your paper being about one species in one place and the fact that you studied it. Right, you want to be starting off and angling your paper to as general and as big a topic as you possibly can. Again, don't overdo it, but you know, go right to the line that's just this side of overdoing it. You've got to do it as much as you can. You've got to try to pitch your paper to as general topics as you can. And this does not just apply to nature and science type journals. This applies to all major disciplinary journals. You know, the best disciplinary journals, they want important work. You know, you can't just publish anything in leading disciplinary journals. You've got to show them that the topics you're working on are of general importance, and that although you might be working on a particular case study or a particular place or taxon or a relatively narrow experiment, but that the implications are big for the field of citizen science or protected area policy or whatever it might be. So work out how you're going to pitch to that big topic area, and try to write a fairly sweeping opening section in the introduction that sets out that big issue. But then, of course, you have to plausibly address that. You can't just arm wave about a giant, big global issue and then say, and then we actually studied this tiny thing over here in this corner that doesn't actually relate to that topic. So you've got to make it work. Importantly, you just got to make your paper about as big an issue as you can, plausibly, in that in your work, not the detailed thing that you studied. Again, there are exceptions, and sometimes you'll be writing regional or local papers that fill a gap in your general research program about a particular topic. You know, you want to get this thing published. Maybe there's observations there that are important, but they're not kind of world-changingly important, but they are, you know, of strong regional value and need to be archived in the scientific literature. You know, then you can write a more detailed paper that focuses on that detailed issue. In general, try to write a paper that's about a big issue, and that your detailed thing that you've studied is an example that helps to move forward our knowledge about that big issue. Okay. When it comes to journal choice, think about the basic things, think about the audience that you want to reach, have a look at some recent issues of papers, of journals that you are contemplating publishing in. A lot of people forget to do this, but just go onto their website and look at their last few issues. What sorts of papers are being published in there? How are those papers written? To what extent do they reach for the skies in terms of general issues, or are they quite happy focusing on the detail really from the get-go? Take a lead a bit from the papers that you're reading in possible target journals. And let me reassure you, I think that choosing a target journal is ultimately pretty arbitrary, and it's not. There are many possible ways that papers could end up. It's not the be-all and end-all. And then if you've chosen journal A instead of journal B, that's not the end of your career. You know, it's a bit arbitrary, and you're going to get different viewpoints from different co-authors on journals. But, you know, take all the advice you can get and assimilate that together. You may want to then reissue that as a list to your co-authors and say, look, you know, we've had these suggestions. What do people think? For me, journals are about prestige. They're about reputation. They're about confidence. They're a bit like currencies, I think. You can sort of value them numerically. So we have things like impact factors and so on. But they're also down to whether people think they're good journals or not, right? In the sense that a currency only really works if people have confidence in it. I think the same is really true for journals. So I think trust the advice and thoughts of some of the more senior co-authors in your group about that. Don't focus purely on things like impact factor. That doesn't help you, I think. Impact factor varies a lot, especially across fields. Different fields work at very different paces, and different sorts of journals can have higher or lower impact factors, even within a discipline, that don't always reflect the quality of the papers being published, or the confidence or the prestige in which that journal is held by colleagues. A few people having to leave just now, that's okay. Thank you for joining. I'm going to finish these points in about 2 more minutes, and then I will get finished. So don't just think about that. Another thing, think about how rounded your CV is. Think about your publishing CV. I've covered this in detail already. Disciplinary journals, good disciplinary journals, occasional multidisciplinary hits if you can get them. You know, but keep trying for those when it's appropriate. Don't send everything to Nature and Science and PNAS, but do it when you get a chance, when you feel you've got a good shot. But build a broad range of different journals. If you think, oh, every paper I'm writing seems like it should go in diversity and distributions or whatever, don't send them multiple streams of papers to the same journal. Choose other journals, try to spread things out a bit, try to show that you can publish in a range of different journals. in general, think about where you could go, and then maybe sort of +1. Don't +10 or 100, +1. You know, try a bit beyond. Try to push yourself. Think, you know, on a good day we could get it into that one. Well, have a go. Try it. There's several counterpoints to that. The main one is that sometimes time is of the essence. If you need to publish quickly, then you may need to sacrifice, or you may need to choose journals more carefully, also based on speed, not just on quality and prestige. Another tip, don't always go down market if you get rejected from a journal. You know, you can always trade up. Sometimes I had a paper once where it was just languishing, being rejected in journals, fairly regional and discipline specific, you know, very narrow disciplinary journals. And it was just getting rejected and I couldn't understand why. And eventually we decided, well, let's just trade up. So we went back up again to a much broader, higher impact, still disciplinary, but a much more discipline leading journal, and got straight in there. So I think, you know, that they kind of, it resonated with them in a way that it hadn't in those narrower disciplinary journals. So if you get rejected, I portrayed it as a game of snakes and ladders in session 1 of this, but it's not always like that. Sometimes you can sneakily run up a ladder and successfully publish a paper in a much higher quality journal than the one you've been rejected from. Okay, there's a really good question in the chat about considerations around open access. That will take a good while to answer, so I'm going to come back to that in the next session. I'll drop that into the Google Doc to make sure it's in there. So I'm going to finish now. Thank you very much for joining us today, and there'll be another session in 2 days' time, Wednesday the 22nd of July at midday Brisbane time. So do please join us then, or catch up with the sessions on YouTube. Thank you very much for all your thanks, and thanks for joining us. I hope this is time well invested for you. You know, I realise it's a big chunk out of your time. Hope it's useful to you, and catch you all again on Wednesday. Thank you very much.